Hello, lovely Nicola.
Hello, hello, hello.
I wanted to start this conversation with you by asking, what is sacrosanct, or what's your understanding of sacrosanct, and what is sacrosanct in your life?
Oh, I love those questions. And in fact, before we came on together, I sat in meditation on sacrosanct because I knew that we were going to have this conversation. So sacrosanct for me, I think in terms of what I understand or how I take it, it's really, I just love the word sacred. And so whenever I think of sacrosanct, I think of sacred. And then that then leads me to, okay, what is sacred in my life, and what does that look like? And the first thing immediately that comes to my mind when you say that is my kids. You know, my kids are just that. They're just that piece for me. And often when I allow myself to like come away from all the noise of all these things that are like important, I think we think so much is important, yet when we go to sacrosanct, it's so much deeper, isn't it? It's so much deeper. And then when I can go to that place, I can go, actually, all these things that I thought were important aren't really important. And my kids are first and foremost, and my family. And then I come to me and the things that are kind of sacrosanct to me. And for me, that is kind of silence, solitude, reading poetry. I love to read poetry. And then there's another side to that, which is if you catch me in a kind of somatic dance in all like my wild, free, messy rawness, that's sacrosanct to me as well. Yeah.
I love all of that. And the bit that I love particularly is this piece around everything being important.
Yeah.
And that's true. And so on the one hand, for me, like having this podcast, having the opportunity is exactly that. Like I want to talk about how all of life is important and valuable, even the pieces that we deem not shiny enough, not special enough, not, I don't even know what, right? Like,
yeah,
oh, you know, the grief is sacrosanct, that meh
yes,
is sacrosanct, that duvet days are sacrosanct, that it doesn't have to be, you know, beach days or standing in front of the Eiffel Tower or some kind of Machu Picchu adventure, right? Like it's all sacrosanct. And yet at the same time, this piece that you said around if it's all important, and I see this a lot in my clients, like everything's important, so I'm overwhelmed and I don't know what's the most important.
Yeah, exactly.
That means that like nothing happens. And so for me, again, that's why the value filter is so important, because it helps us really focus, like, what is important today? What is important in this moment? Like where do I want my focus and attention to be?
Yeah, I love that around kind of what's important today, because it doesn't stay the same, does it? I just literally, and you mentioning duvet days, you've just taken me back to 2 weeks ago when I took the day off. In fact, it was the day after my mum's anniversary of her death, and I'd taken a whole day just to keep it free, to see what was calling. And what was calling was Bridgerton. and I literally laid in bed in the morning and I did some work because I felt inspired, and so I did some writing. But I love that, like, what is important, what is sacred, what's needed in this moment. And it changes, doesn't it, depending on the day, the cycle.
The point of meditation for me, I don't call it meditation anymore, because for me meditation is like sit still, and I know it's not. I've spent years and years like moving that myth, right?
But meditation
for me is about connecting to our power greater than me, or connecting to
Yeah.
Gaia or source, or whether that's up or down or out, it's always outside of me. And so my practice these days, and again, it likely will shift and change, but is connecting to me and going in and finding the Gaia within, and finding the universe within, and really going into myself. And in that, from that space, I can then go out and connect kind of into infinity. But it's from there that I'm like, what's present right now? Like, what's important? We're back at this word of like, what's important for me to honor today, or for me to be with today. Yeah.
And I find, when I love what you said about meditation, because I often say that to my clients too. We've got this image, haven't we, that we sit there cross-legged and that's what it's about. But for me, it's the same. You just articulated it, like that connection to me. And this morning when I sat, and I haven't sat for a couple of days, and that's okay. And I do like sitting, that works for me. But then that quietness that comes in, that allows me to tune into, you know, that what's important, rather than, you know, all the noise that's there generally. And I find kind of in the mornings when I'm trying to get my kids to put their shoes on, so sitting and being in quiet, however that might look, or going for a walk, or however it might look, then allows me to get to that place where I go, okay, I'm here. First and foremost, I'm here, and then kind of what's needed. Not all the time.
And I want to go in on that a little bit. So
go
on. You mentioned the anniversary of your mum's death, and that plays a deep part actually in your work these days.
It does.
And so you just mentioned, right, like tuning in and going, oh, what's needed. And so there's these two concepts that you and I have talked about a lot.
I
want to kind of share a little bit with the world and unpack and come out with curiosity. And that's nourishment, of like what's needed today. And then also looking actually at grief and honoring grief from a place of nourishment, because I think one of the things that, I don't know whether it comes from me or whether it's a societal thing, but very often grief is about not nourishing, right? Like by not nourishing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. What comes to my mind actually is I went to a funeral in January, and it was really interesting sitting there kind of from where I am today, a bit like you say, we just everything keeps changing, doesn't it? And what I noticed is everybody trying to hold on so tightly to their emotions, like nobody could kind of let go. And I noticed I was doing that, when I know what's good for me is allowing it rather than pushing it down. And kind of there was this moment where people let go a little bit, and then like we're outside and we're like, oh, and for me, that isn't the nourishment of grief, you know, that trying to hold on, that trying to make it okay, because grief is just so messy and so raw, and actually it can be scary because of that. You know, because there's been times when I felt like if I allow myself to really go there, I'm not going to be able to come back up, because it's felt that dark and that deep. So I think your question around how do you nourish yourself in grief is a really good one. And I'm not sure I know the answer, but I can share my own experience, you know, because it's like 15 years now. So my grief is very different 15 years later to how it was in those, you know, those really initial moments where, you know, people talk of a broken heart, and I thought I'd had my heart broken before that point. And then when my mum died, I lit the pain, the physical pain I felt in my heart was just, I just never experienced anything like it. I really thought my heart was going to shatter into 1,000 pieces. That's kind of how it felt in those moments. And it was just survival. in those, like getting through, we had to organise the funeral, all of those sorts of things. It was just pure survival back then. And now, I suppose what I shared in terms of what I did on that day, you know, so stayed in bed for a while, watched Bridgerton, did some writing, because writing is kind of good for my soul and nourishing. Then I went to the cemetery. I had a good chat with Mum. I had a cry. I bought some roses and I put half on her grave and I took half home with me. And for me, that's the nourishment of grief, allowing that time and space. And just to give you a contrast, so there's 2 days for me that I find the most tricky in terms of grief, and that's Mother's Day and it's the anniversary. Her birthday seems to come and go, and it just, there's other things that but those are the 2 days that kind of really impact. And Mother's Day this year was completely the opposite. So I didn't have time and space to myself, and then it ended up all in me, because I had this kind of dichotomy of wanting to honor my mum and my loss and my grief and nourish my grief, versus can I celebrate myself as a mother and the kids being around and everyone being around. And it just, and it came the day after, because I didn't allow the space, because I didn't give it space. It kind of ended up a little bit more, I used the word wretched when I wrote about it. That was the word that described it. It was really like, it was much more painful and clunky. And so those are kind of, and those were like a month apart from each other. So just those differences. Yeah.
And it strikes me that with grief, and again, don't know if it's me or society, right? And grief isn't beautifully integrated, and that's why the work that you do in the world is so important, right? Grief isn't integrated into our societies very well.
No.
And when I hear you talk about, you know, intentional grieving or not grieving,
yes,
the kind of consequences of that 15 years later, there's a kind of part of me that's like, oh wow, I mean, that's a long time to still be really experiencing these feelings.
Yeah.
And I guess, so I'm curious, like, when you're working with people around grief and this idea of nourishing grief, when do they tend to come to you? Like, is it when it's really raw? Is it further down the line? Is it like, I'm just curious.
Yeah.
And like this idea of, you know, because there might be people listening going, well, my mum died, or this happened for, you know, I had this experience, or I lost a child, or whatever it is, right? There's grief, but I didn't do anything about it then. Like, can I nourish it now? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I think I love that question, and I love it because what I noticed, where my mind wanted to take me to this year, particularly when it was messier around Mother's Day, you know, in the mess, in the, you know, not creating space, the dialogue that came in really strongly was, it's 15 years now, I should be over this, you know, that kind of, I don't know, like you say, conditioning maybe, that it's 15 years, I should, and it was so unconscious, and it was so good to kind of catch it and go, oh, that's interesting that dialogue's there, that in some way, you know, we should be over it. And yet, you know, and we're talking about a particular type of grief, which is bereavement and death and grief through that. And, you know, I love my mum. I love her dearly, and I can talk about her, and I want to talk about her, and she's part of me, she's part of my children. And so, and again, I don't know whether this will change, but my experience is that we can learn to dance with grief, that it's within me, and sometimes it comes up at really unexpected times, you know. My daughter's birthday was an example. I think it was last year that suddenly I was like, oh, Mum, you're missing this. you know. And I hadn't expected, whereas like Mother's Day and the anniversary I can kind of plan for, but then it just comes in unexpectedly. And I think it's just a sign of the love that was there, that I'm like, oh, you're missing this. And, you know, and so then it kind of changes, you know. My mum died before I had children, and so there's all these different nuances and different elements to grief and how kind of you travel with it, I think. So when do people come to me? Like, whenever is the answer. They may come to me years later. In fact, I'm working with somebody at the moment, and it's a lot of years later, like around 30 years later. So, you know, it's whenever, because I do think that grief is part of all of us. We just don't talk about it in that way.
And I feel like, you know, we put this in the embodiment section, right? And I feel like there's an important piece for us to talk about in terms of how the body stores unexpressed and particularly unexpressed grief. And I mean, I've got no idea how unexpressed grief shows up, because for me it's always been unexpressed shame or unexpressed anger. I know how they show up in my body, but is there any pattern or rhythm or signs of unexpressed grief in the body?
I think it is. What I see is like a deep protection. You know, like, you know, that how I explained around my heart, and I thought it was, that's what I see, is the heart is like so protected. It's like there's it's like it, I always like to see, like, it's like it's in a box. And that's what I see, like this real protection, because it's so painful. And so usually what I see in my clients is a tightness in the body. You know, and if people have been watching me, they will have seen it in me as well, a tightness in my body, you know, that's quite rigid. And it's just that pain that's just been like shut down, unable to be expressed, you know, because grief is quite animal, you know, in its nature. And I remember you know, the day my mum died, and the howl that came out of me was just, I can still remember it, and I can still remember the uncomfortability of the person that was with me at that time. And I think that's the thing for grief, and that's why it becomes so shut down, is because it makes everybody around us uncomfortable, because nobody knows how to sit with it. And it's that tightness, it's that like real heart protection, and kind of I want to say like that sense of like a deep sadness, like it's like there's a deep sadness underneath the I'm okay, but you can just sense it at the back somehow. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think when I use my MBIT brain, when I use my multiple brain integration technique, and looking at the different ways that the heart expresses, and the functions of our heart as an intelligence, which is really about emoting, valuing, and entraining, connecting with others, right? There's this kind of, with unexpressed grief, there's an unwillingness to engage in the depth of life, of the feeling of life. And so it's like, it's almost rejecting any range or richness of emotion, because it comes with consequences. And so in order to stop yourself from ever being heartbroken again, or to ever reach that place of grief again, or to open a floodgate which then feels like it will, you know, engulf you, it's like the range of feeling is shrunk so that it becomes safe. And the unfortunate, I mean, I don't know whether that's true, but the you can't selectively choose what you really want to feel. When we close the heart down, we close the heart down.
Yeah, that's it. And do you know what hit me in just what you were saying then, is like the kind of the shrinking to life. And I think I think if we allow it, that can be the gift of grief, because I'm always very conscious that it's not like this kind of false positivity, but what it's given me is those moments where I'll drive down my road and we've got blossom trees like on the side of our road, and when they're in full bloom, it's just like, so what grief has given me is that kind of that richness to life, that kind of I mean, everybody says it, life's short, but I think in touching death in that way, you do really realize, and you do go back to normal, a bit like what we were saying in the beginning, and then about all the things that are important that maybe aren't important. But there's a richness if you can open yourself up to it that it gave me. And like I say, that's not in a covering up kind of way.
No, I mean, my experience is I've watched a lot of people die. I've had a lot of life, but you wouldn't know that about me because I have felt it, been really present to it, moved through it. You know, that's not that there wasn't, you know, I was in my mid-20s, I was suicidal for a long time, and really facing that shadow and really going into my heartland and coming out the other side and really recognizing that I'm still here.
Yeah.
And they're not. And rather than being like, well, I don't want to be, if they're not, then really coming to a place of like, I'm going to live for all of us. And so it has made me more courageous. It's made me more self-expressive. It's made me, you know, I see things, I'm like, oh, Freya would do that, or you know, or Laura would do that, or she would be there with me. And so I take them on those adventures when I'm scared. There's various times. I remember when I first moved to Spain, and I was terrified of driving on the other side of the road. People think it's hilarious. Like, I'm terrified by a lot of life, but people always look at me and go, "You're so courageous," and it's a choice. And I remember, and I could see Freya sitting next to me, and she was like, "Oh, babe, you'll be fine. Come on, let's do it. Be an adventure. What's the worst that can happen?" And I had her whole voice in my head. I was just like, "Okay, I'm doing this for you so that you'll shut up and leave me alone." And just fine. And I have this totem for her of yellow flowers. And I went down the road, and suddenly there were just yellow flowers everywhere driving down the road. And it was just that whole thing of like, thank you for giving me life, like giving me that range of motion, allowing me to push through and to find courage, and to, you know, always being with me in those moments that are terrifying. And so I think there is such richness on the other side.
Yeah. And how have you found it, Ebony? Do you find it still with you? Do you like, is it there and you dance with it? How is it for you?
And it depends on the relationship that I have with that person. And it's funny because I go, well, you know, it's no one really important. Voice that goes, I disagree. And again, it's around this like societal thing of like, well, it wasn't a parent, or it wasn't a child, or it wasn't this, or but whatever. You know, my sister wrote a poem about grief, which I shared on my Instagram yesterday, but she's got such a beautiful way with words. And one of the things that I find the most irritating about grief is we have these prescribed days that we're supposed to grieve on, right? Like after time, like it's okay to grieve on their birthday, or it's okay on an occasion when they would be there. So like all of my brothers and sisters are getting married over that day, right? And like the key people won't be there, and that's sad. But what happens for me is like at inconvenient moments of like this, like having a random conversation, and all of a sudden I'm crying. I'm like, fuck, come on, this is not the time. Well, then other days when it's her birthday and I'm not sad, and I'm like, you're supposed to be sad today, this isn't a long day. It makes sense to people if you're sad today. And that's the piece around grief that I find irritating.
Isn't it so funny, a bit like that when I said, you know, it's 15 years now, I should be over it, and you know that they weren't that important, and
I'm just like, just in case you're listening,
Yeah.
you're really important.
You're really important. But I always say, I held a grief circle a couple of weeks ago, and I always open up those spaces saying there's no hierarchy to grief. Just because somebody might be talking about their mother and you're talking about your friend or whatever it is, it doesn't make your grief any worse or any less. There's like there's no hierarchy to grief, but that kind of, I'm just going to say it, that societal conditioning over importance again of, you know, how it is, and wanting to label it as, you know, worse or better, and it just isn't. It's, you know, it's just the grief. And I would be petrified about driving on the other side of the road. Just want to say that. So I might need Freya with me.
Fine. I'm aware of time, and so I love that we've touched on some things here, and I hope that we've got people thinking and looking at this stuff a little bit differently. You just mentioned a grief circle there, and there'll be a lot of people who are like, what is that? And so in Sacrosanct Secrets, we will dive a little bit further into some more stuff. There's some specific questions I want to ask you, but if anyone's just listening to this and they want to come and find you and find out more, where's the best place for them to come?
Instagram seems to be my home, so I'm Nicola_Duffell at Instagram, and then my website, which is nicoladuffell.com. So
Fab.
Thank you.
I'm going to put all the links in and make it really easy, and so if you do go and find Nicola, then let her know where you found her. That would be awesome. And yeah, we're gonna pause and then come back.
We're gonna carry on.